Greetings, traveler. I am SnapJelly, and Link's Master Sword from the Zelda games. Is it realistic? Well, I can't give you a straight yes or no answer on this one, simply because of different depictions of the Master Sword in different games, and also different depictions of Link in the games. Like, just one example, the length of the blade was hard to determine because I thought that I could measure the length of the blade compared to the length of Link, but I couldn't find a set height of Link. So, yeah, it's quite difficult to say, but there are some very slight design changes you can make that would make the blade, regardless of anything, several times more practical. So, join me in my quest, and I'll tell you why. So first, let's assess what kind of sword the Master Sword is based on its length. Now, like I said, it's impossible to get an exact length of the sword, but we can clearly see that Link uses it one-handed. So you could say that it's an arming sword, or a one-handed sword because of that. But in many cases it is simply depicted to be incredibly long compared to Link. That, and looking at the grip, you can see that there's plenty of space for a second hand there. So it'd be safer to say that the Master Sword is a bastard sword at the least. In some cases, just looking at the length compared to Link, you could even argue that it's a dedicated longsword or a two-handed sword. Now, looking at this guard, would it function? I'd say, yeah. It's a bit odd, right? It's a very unique design, and it surely has some assets that are purely decorative and have no practical value whatsoever. But I can say that it wouldn't function as a guard. It looks like it would do its job, and there's nothing that would get in the way or would be poking your arm in any annoying way, so there's nothing really that I can say about it. Next thing, though, is this part, this tiny little unsharpened piece on the blade. I have no idea why that's there. Why would you have, like, a tiny little unsharpened piece right there? I don't know what that's supposed to do. So fact is, I think it doesn't really do anything. There's no need for that to be unsharpened. But I also don't think that it would necessarily be a problem because you don't really cut with that part anyway. What would be a problem though is if this part extends, because it's sometimes depicted to extend past the rest of the blade, thus be wider than the rest of the blade, and sometimes it's not. If it is, then that causes some problems. It is edged a little bit so it wouldn't stop an incoming blade. Swords that would slide off would kind of just be lifted off of your sword, so it would kind of release contact and clunking all over your sword. Yeah, so that's not really gonna help. And when you're fighting something that's not human, like a monster of any sorts, then it wouldn't be that much of a problem, but still, considering you're stabbing it, for example, then that is really your limit. When you're stabbing a very big monster and you try to get your sword in there all the way, yeah, it's not gonna extend past this because it's unsharpened and it's thicker, so it's just gonna be hard to jam the sword all the way up there. It would probably still be plenty of penetration if you don't get it all the way up there, but it's just, you know, it doesn't do anything for you. And now let's talk about the Ricasso. Ricasso is, if you don't know, a little unsharpened piece at usually the base of the blade, very close to the guard. When you say Ricasso, people usually think about greatswords, but honestly, all kinds of swords can have Ricassos. But I'm not sure if this is a Ricasso. Just if you look at it up close, it honestly looks like it's sharpened. In most depictions, in fact, it does look like it's sharpened. And again, I don't know why. Why would there be a blunt piece right here and then sharpened again in this weird curve? I mean, the dull piece isn't going to do much for you. The sharpness here isn't going to do much for you either. It's just a weird aesthetic choice. That honestly, it's not good or bad. It's kind of just nothing. It doesn't really have any benefits, nor does it really have any downsides. Arguably, it's not ideal, but I wouldn't say it's the worst thing. The only real problem that I would have with this sword is that it's probably incredibly heavy to use. Just looking at a few things that this blade has, right? Just the blade. First off, it's a hexagonal cross-section, right? That's fine. But it has no fuller. Secondly, there are these things called profile taper and distal taper. The profile taper is how the sword gradually turns into a point if you look at it from the top. Right? And the distal taper is the same, looking at it from the side, how it gradually becomes more of a point. The Master Sword looks like it has neither of these things. It has no profile taper whatsoever. It's completely straight all the way up until the end, where it very quickly turns into a point. The rest is completely straight, and it's very hard to see, but it looks like it has no distal taper either, considering how it's sharpened. It really just looks like a flat piece of metal with the edges grinded into sharpness. All of those things I just mentioned aid in making the sword lighter. First off, the profile taper and distal taper. As your sword gradually turns into a point, that means it lessens the amount of material used. If your sword is literally thinner at the end, then it's not as tip heavy. So if the sword would have a profile taper and a distal taper, it could still be just as long, but instead use less material, thus it would be lighter. And looking at the hexagonal cross-section, there are swords with hexagonal cross-sections, but again it uses a lot of material. If you would change the hexagonal cross-section for, let's say, a diamond cross-section, but keep it the same thickness, then not only would you use less material, but the edge would be way thinner as well, so arguably the sword would be sharper. Now on the other hand, something like a hexagonal cross-section is very thick. The edge is thicker, it would still be incredibly sharp, and it would be sturdier. The edge would technically not be as sharp as on a diamond cross-section, but on the other hand it would get less edge damage. So it's a compromise. You get less sharpness, but more sturdiness and less edge damage, but it would also be heavier. In coming the fuller. One of the things that a fuller does is quite simply it takes away a little bit of the material. This allows for swords to be longer, without getting too heavy. Especially if the sword is as wide as the Master Sword is. It just seems like a single, long, flat slab of steel with the edges sharpened. And considering how long and how wide it would be insanely heavy for a sword. Would it be too heavy to use? No, you could still swing it and you could still kill people with it, but compared to other swords it just would not be practical. Could you still use it with one hand? Yes, technically, but you would imagine that Link would have some incredibly thick forearms and some incredibly large shoulders because of it. So that was it, guys. I hope you enjoyed. If you stuck around this long, you might as well subscribe and also follow me on social media. Links are in the description below, and thank you for joining my quest, and I hope you'll join me in the next one. Bye, guys.